It only takes one bad decision before sunrise to change two lives forever. At exactly 5:02 a.m., while most of the city still slept beneath a blanket of fading darkness, the quiet streets of Ashcroft Heights belonged to only a handful of early risers. Porch lights glowed softly against perfectly trimmed lawns, sprinklers whispered across fresh grass, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the nearly empty neighborhood. It was the kind of peaceful morning that usually passed unnoticed, where every sound seemed louder simply because the world had not fully awakened. A lone runner moved steadily along the sidewalk, his footsteps measured, his breathing calm and consistent. Dressed in a gray hoodie, a black knit beanie, dark running pants, and worn athletic shoes, he blended naturally into the muted colors of dawn. His pace never hurried, never slowed. Running before sunrise had been part of his daily routine for years, long before anyone recognized his name, and long before titles or headlines ever followed him. To anyone passing by, he looked like another man determined to finish his morning miles before the day became crowded. But appearances often invite assumptions, and assumptions can become expensive mistakes. A police cruiser rolled slowly around the corner, its headlights cutting through the dim morning haze before stopping beside the runner. Behind the wheel sat Officer Brandon Pierce, a white patrol officer only months into his assignment covering one of the city's wealthiest districts. He had been reminded repeatedly during briefing that residents expected proactive policing, that suspicious activity should never be ignored, and that trespassing complaints had increased in recent weeks. As Brandon watched the runner continue along the sidewalk, something about the gray hoodie, the knit cap, and the unfamiliar face immediately caught his attention. Without waiting to observe longer, he activated the cruiser's emergency lights. The quiet neighborhood suddenly filled with flashes of red and blue reflecting across expensive homes and parked luxury vehicles. The runner slowed to a stop, turned calmly toward the cruiser, and removed one earbud. Without the slightest sign of panic. "Morning, officer," he said with a polite nod. Brandon stepped out, keeping his expression firm. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked. "Getting my morning run in," the man answered evenly. "I do this almost every day." Brandon scanned him from head to toe before glancing toward the surrounding houses. "Do you live around here?" he asked. The runner smiled faintly. "Not far." It should have been an ordinary conversation. Instead, Brandon's tone hardened. He informed the runner that residents had reported suspicious individuals entering private property and that he matched the description closely enough to justify further investigation. The man remained composed, speaking clearly and respectfully, never raising his voice, never making sudden movements, never giving anyone watching a reason to believe he posed the slightest threat. Yet the atmosphere had already changed. A delivery driver slowed his van. An elderly couple walking their dog paused across the street. A security camera mounted above a nearby garage silently recorded every second. Brandon instructed the runner to place his hands where he could see them while he investigated a possible criminal trespassing complaint. The man complied without argument, his face calm despite the growing audience. Then, in a voice so steady it almost disappeared into the cool morning air, he quietly said, "Officer, I believe you're making a mistake that will cost someone far more than either of us realizes." Brandon dismissed the remark without another thought. If only he had known who stood before him. The rest of that morning would have unfolded very differently. Officer Brandon Pierce studied the man for another moment, expecting hesitation, excuses, or nervousness, but none of them came. The runner remained perfectly composed, his breathing steady from a morning exercise rather than from fear. There was something unusual about that calm, yet Brandon interpreted it as confidence that needed to be challenged instead of understood. "Identification," Brandon said. The man reached slowly into the pocket of his gray hoodie, exactly as instructed, and produced a simple leather wallet. There was no designer logo, no obvious symbol of status, nothing that suggested wealth or influence. Brandon glanced at the driver's license without truly seeing the person standing in front of him. His attention remained fixed on the address, the neighborhood map in his memory, and the recent complaints that had dominated the morning briefing. "You said you run here every day," Brandon said. "That is correct," the man answered politely. "For how long?" "Several years." Brandon looked around the quiet street again. Every house appeared untouched. No gates were open. No alarm sounded. No homeowner had stepped outside to report crime. Even so, he convinced himself that preventing trouble was better than waiting for it to happen. Across the street, the elderly couple with the golden retriever continued watching from a respectful distance. The delivery driver remained parked near the curb, pretending to organize packages while quietly observing the conversation. A porch camera blinked with its familiar blue recording light. Somewhere nearby, another homeowner adjusted a curtain just enough to peek outside. The neighborhood had become an audience without saying a word. The runner folded his hands comfortably in front of him and asked, "May I know which property I am accused of entering?" Brandon paused for a second. The question was direct, reasonable, and impossible to answer with certainty. "We are investigating suspicious activity," he replied. "You fit the circumstances." The man nodded once, almost as if he had heard similar words before. "Officer, I understand your responsibility. I only ask that you base your decision on facts rather than assumptions." Brandon frowned. To him, the statement sounded less like cooperation and more like someone attempting to challenge his authority. He requested a records check through dispatch, then waited beside the cruiser while the morning air remained cool and still. Birds had begun filling the silence with their first songs of the day, and the eastern horizon slowly shifted from deep blue to pale orange. It should have felt like the beginning of an ordinary morning. Instead, every passing second seemed to tighten the invisible tension surrounding the sidewalk. The dispatcher acknowledged the request, but explained that the system was processing multiple overnight reports and would take another minute. Brandon looked back toward the runner, who stood patiently without complaint. He was not pacing. He was not arguing. He simply waited with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that truth never needed to rush. The elderly woman across the street leaned toward her husband and whispered something before pulling out her phone. The delivery driver did the same. More cameras were now pointed in Brandon's direction than he realized. None of them captured anger. None of them captured resistance. They recorded something far more powerful. A respectful citizen cooperating fully while being treated as though his presence alone required justification. Brandon believed he was protecting the neighborhood. He did not yet realize that every decision he made during those early morning minutes was quietly building the foundation for a case that would soon be examined far beyond the streets of Ashcroft Heights. The response from dispatch finally broke through the quiet crackle of the patrol radio. But it was not the answer Officer Brandon Pierce expected. "Stand by," the dispatcher said. "There appears to be additional information attached to the identification." Brandon glanced toward the man in the gray hoodie, who remained standing exactly where he had been instructed. His expression never changed. There was no irritation, no sarcasm, and no attempt to rush the process. Instead, he quietly watched the first rays of sunlight stretch across the rooftops, as if he had nowhere more important to be. Brandon interpreted that calm as unusual confidence, and the longer it continued, the more determined he became to prove that his instincts had been correct from the beginning. "Until I receive confirmation, you are being detained as part of this investigation," Brandon said firmly. The man acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. "I understand," he replied. "I only hope every decision today is made with the same patience you expect from the public." The words lingered in the cool morning air. They sounded less like a warning than a simple observation, but Brandon ignored their meaning. He asked another patrol unit to head toward his location as a precaution. Within minutes, a second police vehicle appeared at the end of the quiet street, its tires rolling slowly over the smooth pavement without disturbing the peaceful neighborhood. The arrival of another officer drew even more attention from nearby residents. Curtains open wider. Garage doors paused halfway. Joggers approaching from the opposite direction slowed to watch before choosing another route. The story was beginning long before anyone understood what it would become. Brandon briefly explained that he believed he had interrupted a possible trespassing situation involving an unidentified individual moving through a private residential area before sunrise. His fellow officer looked toward the man in the hoodie and quietly asked, "Did anyone report seeing him on private property?" Brandon hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, "We are still verifying that." The runner listened without interrupting. He never attempted to defend himself beyond calmly repeating that he had remained on public sidewalks throughout his morning exercise. His words were precise, respectful, and consistent. Every answer matched the last. Every movement reflected patience instead of frustration. It was an unusual kind of composure, the kind built through years of discipline rather than a single morning of inconvenience. Dispatch called again. "Officer Pierce, we are still verifying identity through additional records. Please remain on the line." Brandon frowned. He had never seen a routine identification take this long. He assumed it was a technical issue, nothing more. Yet inside the communications center, several miles away, employees had already begun making unexpected phone calls after noticing security classifications attached to the name appearing on their screens. A supervisor quietly walked toward another desk. A second employee checked the information twice before looking at the clock. No one wanted to make assumptions, but everyone understood that the record in front of them did not belong to an ordinary citizen. Back on the street, Malcolm Reed looked toward the brightening horizon. The sunrise painted the clouds with soft shades of gold and orange, reminding him that another busy day would soon begin. He had planned to finish his run, return home, and prepare for a series of meetings that carried enormous responsibility. Instead, his schedule had been replaced by a misunderstanding that seemed to grow more complicated with every passing minute. As Brandon waited for dispatch to respond again, he remained convinced that procedure was on his side. What he did not know was that the next voice to come across his radio would not simply answer a question. It would begin unraveling every assumption that had guided his decision since 5 o'clock. That morning, Officer Brandon Pierce shifted his weight as another minute slipped away, the silence becoming more uncomfortable than any argument could have been. He expected frustration from the man standing before him, but Malcolm Reed remained remarkably patient, his eyes following the gradual sunrise as golden light spread across the quiet neighborhood. It was almost as though he refused to allow someone else's assumptions to steal his peace. Brandon looked down at the identification once again, studying the name more carefully this time. Malcolm Reed. The address was valid. The date of birth matched the records already confirmed. Nothing about the identification appeared fraudulent. Yet dispatch continued delaying its final response. To Brandon, the delay felt suspicious. To everyone else watching, it felt increasingly obvious that something was not adding up. The second officer quietly stepped closer. "He has been cooperative this entire time," he said in a lower voice. "Maybe we should wait for dispatch before taking this any further." Brandon answered without taking his eyes off Malcolm. "If I let someone walk away before verifying everything, and it turns out I ignored something important, that responsibility falls on me." The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but it rested on a conclusion that had never been supported by evidence. Malcolm listened respectfully before speaking again. "Officer, there is an important difference between investigating facts and protecting assumptions. The first strengthens public trust. The second weakens it." Brandon looked directly at him. "Are you giving me legal advice?" Malcolm smiled politely. "No, I am simply sharing something I have learned through experience." The answer only deepened Brandon's confidence that the man was attempting to sound more important than he really was. Around them, more neighbors had stepped outside after noticing the flashing patrol lights. A young father carrying a cup of coffee stood beside his driveway. A woman preparing for work remained on her front porch. The delivery driver quietly resumed placing packages at nearby homes, although his phone camera continued recording from his shirt pocket. None of them heard raised voices. None of them witnessed threats. What they observed instead was a respectful conversation that seemed to continue only because one person refused to reconsider an assumption made several minutes earlier. Then the patrol radio came alive once more. The dispatcher's voice sounded noticeably different, more careful than before. Officer Pierce, please remain where you are. A supervising official has requested that you do not conclude this investigation until additional personnel arrive. Brandon frowned. Additional personnel? For a trespassing investigation. There was a brief pause before the dispatcher answered. That is correct, officer. Please remain at your current location. Brandon exchanged a confused glance with the second officer. Neither of them understood why supervisors would become involved in what had appeared to be a routine stop. Malcolm lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly saying, "Sometimes the smallest decisions become the most important lessons." Brandon did not respond. His confidence had begun to give way to uncertainty, although he refused to show it. Across the street, the elderly couple looked at each other with puzzled expressions as another unmarked government vehicle slowly turned into the neighborhood without activating emergency lights. It moved deliberately, almost silently, before stopping several houses away. A man wearing a dark business suit stepped out, carrying nothing except a thin leather portfolio. He did not rush. He simply looked toward Malcolm Reed, offered a respectful nod, and then began walking calmly toward the gathering. At that moment, Brandon still believed he was waiting for clarification. He had no idea he was about to meet someone who would transform an ordinary patrol stop into a moment that every person standing on that quiet street would remember for years. The man in the dark business suit crossed the street with calm, deliberate steps, never looking at the gathering crowd or the flashing patrol vehicles. His attention remained fixed on Malcolm Reed. As he approached, he offered a respectful smile before speaking in a measured voice. "Good morning, sir. We have been trying to reach you." Malcolm returned the greeting with the same quiet composure he had shown since the encounter began. "It appears I have been occupied," he answered. The suited man nodded once, then turned toward Officer Brandon Pierce. "Good morning, officer. My name is Daniel Foster. I serve as legal counsel for the Administrative Office of the Federal Judiciary." Brandon stared for a moment, uncertain why someone from the federal judiciary would appear at a neighborhood trespassing investigation before sunrise. "Why are you here?" Brandon asked. Daniel opened his leather portfolio and removed a government credential. "Because dispatch contacted our office after your identification request generated a restricted notification." The words seemed to hang in the cool morning air. Brandon accepted the credential, examining the official seal before handing it back. "Restricted notification," he repeated. Daniel remained professional. Certain public officials have security protocols attached to their records. When those records are accessed during active law enforcement encounters, designated offices receive immediate notice. Brandon slowly looked back toward Malcolm. For the first time that morning, uncertainty replaced confidence. "Who exactly is this man?" he asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Malcolm as though asking silent. "Permission." Malcolm simply gave a small nod. Daniel faced the officers once more. "The individual you stopped this morning is Justice Malcolm Reed of the Supreme Court of the United States." Silence settled across the neighborhood more completely than the darkness had only minutes before. Even the nearby conversation stopped. The elderly couple exchanged stunned expressions. The delivery driver lowered his phone without realizing it. The second patrol officer blinked twice, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Brandon remained completely still. His eyes shifted from Malcolm to the identification in his own hand and then back again. Every detail suddenly appeared different. The calm voice, the precise language, the patience, the complete absence of hostility. None of it had been an attempt to impress anyone. It had simply reflected the character of the man standing before him. Daniel continued speaking with the same respectful tone. "Justice Reed does not travel with a security detail during his personal morning exercise unless there is a specific threat assessment. That routine has remained unchanged for several years." Brandon swallowed quietly. His mind raced backward through every decision he had made since activating his emergency lights. Every question, every assumption, every conclusion now carried a different weight. Malcolm finally spoke, not with anger or satisfaction, but with remarkable calm. Officer Pierce, my title does not make this moment important. What makes it important is that the same situation could happen to someone whose name you would never recognize. Those words landed more heavily than any accusation could have. They were not spoken to embarrass Brandon. They were spoken because Malcolm genuinely believed them. Daniel carefully closed his portfolio before adding one final sentence. Justice Reed has an important constitutional conference this morning. I would appreciate your assistance in resolving this matter appropriately so he may continue his day. Brandon looked around at the quiet neighborhood that only minutes earlier had seemed ordinary. Now, every porch camera, every witness, every recorded moment represented something far greater than a routine stop. He had expected dispatch to confirm an investigation. Instead, the morning had quietly revealed a truth that could never be undone. Officer Brandon Pierce felt the confidence he had carried only minutes earlier dissolve into quiet disbelief. The flashing patrol lights that had seemed routine now felt painfully out of place against the peaceful neighborhood. He looked at Justice Malcolm Reed again, almost expecting the composed man in the gray hoodie to reveal that the entire situation had been some elaborate misunderstanding. Instead, Malcolm simply stood with the same calm dignity he had shown from the beginning. There was no satisfaction in his expression. There was no attempt to remind anyone of his position. He merely waited for the process to catch up with the truth. Brandon cleared his throat before speaking. Justice Reed, I was not aware of your identity. Malcolm answered without hesitation. I know you were not, officer. That has never been the central issue. Brandon looked confused. Then what is? Malcolm glanced briefly toward the neighbors, still quietly watching from their driveways, before returning his attention to Brandon. The question is whether someone without my title would have received the same patience once they explained they had done nothing wrong. Those words settled over the gathering more heavily than the morning silence itself. Even Daniel Foster remained quiet, allowing the meaning to speak for itself. The second patrol officer lowered his eyes, reflecting on the encounter from the moment it had begun. Nothing about Malcolm's behavior had justified suspicion beyond the assumptions formed during those first few seconds. Brandon replayed every decision in his mind. The gray hoodie, the knit cap, the unfamiliar face, the early morning hour. Individually, none of those details proved wrongdoing. Yet together they had shaped his judgment before a single fact had been verified. For the first time in his career, he recognized how easily confidence could disguise bias without announcing itself. His patrol radio interrupted the silence once more. This time the voice belonged to his precinct captain. Officer Pierce, remain on scene. Internal command has been notified. Do not take any further enforcement action. We are responding immediately. Brandon quietly acknowledged the instruction. There was no urgency in the captain's voice, only careful professionalism, the kind reserved for situations that would later be reviewed in detail. Around the neighborhood, life slowly resumed. The delivery driver climbed back into his van after completing another stop. The elderly couple continued their morning walk, though they looked back several times as they disappeared around the corner. The rising sun washed the street in warm golden light, replacing the flashing reflections from the patrol vehicles with ordinary daylight. It seemed almost impossible that such a peaceful morning had become the setting for a lesson none of those present would soon forget. Daniel stepped closer to Malcolm. Your transportation is only a few minutes away, he said quietly. Malcolm nodded. Thank you. Then he turned toward Brandon once again. Officer, every person you meet carries a story you cannot see. Some carry titles. Most do not. The law asks us to begin with facts because appearances have never been reliable evidence. Brandon listened without interruption. There was nothing left to defend. The conversation had moved beyond procedures and reports. It had become something far more personal, a reminder that authority demanded not only confidence, but humility. In the distance, another vehicle entered the neighborhood, this one bearing the insignia of police command. As it approached the quiet street, Brandon understood that the next phase of this morning would no longer focus on the man he had stopped. It would focus on every decision that had led to that moment, and on whether those decisions reflected the standards the badge was meant to represent. Police Chief Eleanor Hayes arrived without sirens, without flashing lights, and without the urgency that usually accompanied a major emergency. She stepped out of the command vehicle, carrying only a folder and years of experience. One glance told her that this was not simply another field report waiting to be completed. It was a moment that would test every principle her department claimed to uphold. She greeted Justice Malcolm Reed first with quiet professionalism before turning to Officer Brandon Pierce. "Walk me through everything from the beginning," she said. Brandon spoke carefully, describing the early morning patrol, the recent trespassing complaints, the unfamiliar runner, and the decisions that followed. He answered every question honestly, never attempting to leave out details that might reflect poorly on his judgment. Chief Hayes listened without interruption. When he finished, she nodded once before asking a single question. "Did you personally observe Justice Reed enter private property?" Brandon hesitated. "No, Chief." "Did any resident identify him as a trespasser?" "No, Chief." "Did you receive a confirmed complaint involving him specifically?" Brandon lowered his eyes. "No, Chief." The answers were simple, but together they painted a picture no supervisor wanted to see. Chief Hayes looked toward the second officer. "Your observations?" The officer answered truthfully. "Justice Reed remained respectful from the first moment I arrived. He cooperated with every instruction and repeatedly asked that the investigation rely on facts." Chief Hayes thanked him before requesting immediate preservation of every available recording. Body camera footage, patrol vehicle cameras, radio communications, neighborhood surveillance systems. She wanted the complete timeline secured before memories had the chance to replace facts. Daniel Foster quietly informed her that several nearby homeowners had already volunteered copies of their security footage. The delivery driver had also approached another supervisor, offering the recording from his mobile phone. No one had coordinated those decisions. Ordinary citizens simply believed the complete story deserved to be preserved. As the evidence began arriving, one pattern quickly became impossible to ignore. Every recording showed the same calm interaction from different angles. Justice Reed never argued. He never refused instructions. He never acted aggressively or attempted to leave. The conversations remained respectful throughout. Yet the justification for the detention never became clearer because the facts never changed. Chief Hayes closed the folder in her hands and took a slow breath. "This review will not focus on titles," she said quietly. "If this encounter would have been inappropriate for any ordinary citizen, then it remains inappropriate regardless of who Justice Reed is." Malcolm looked at her with genuine appreciation. "That is exactly the principle worth protecting," he replied. The chief nodded. "The badge exists to serve the Constitution, not assumptions." Brandon stood silently nearby, listening to every word. He realized the investigation had already become much larger than his own career. It was now about public trust, professional judgment, and whether the department possessed the courage to examine its own mistakes with the same seriousness it expected from the communities it served. Reporters had not yet arrived. Social media had not yet exploded with speculation. For the moment, the truth still belonged to those standing on that quiet street, preserved by cameras that never formed opinions and recordings that never forgot what actually happened. As another supervisor confirmed that all digital evidence had been secured for formal review, the morning sun climbed higher above Ashcroft Heights, illuminating a scene where facts, rather than assumptions, would soon determine what justice required next. The formal review began before the morning had even ended. By noon, every recording had been synchronized into a single timeline. Body camera footage, dispatch audio, dashboard video, neighborhood security cameras, and recordings voluntarily provided by residents all told the same story from different perspectives. None of them showed Justice Malcolm Reed entering private property. None of them documented a complaint identifying him by name or description. None of them revealed behavior that would reasonably support the conclusion that he had committed criminal trespassing. Instead, every recording captured the same quiet reality. A citizen had been stopped while lawfully exercising before sunrise, answered every question respectfully, complied with every instruction, and repeatedly encouraged the investigation to rely on facts rather than assumptions. The evidence spoke with a consistency no witness could improve upon. During the internal review, Chief Eleanor Hayes addressed the command staff with unusual clarity. "This is not about protecting reputations," she said. "It is about protecting public confidence. The community expects us to recognize mistakes as quickly as we expect citizens to follow the law." No one challenged her conclusion because the evidence left little room for disagreement. Officer Brandon Pierce participated fully in every interview. He admitted that his initial suspicion had been influenced by circumstances that, in hindsight, were never supported by objective evidence. He acknowledged that he allowed assumptions to remain in place even after Justice Reed had consistently cooperated. His honesty did not erase the consequences, but it ensured the review focused on learning rather than denial. Justice Reed, meanwhile, declined multiple requests for public interviews. Friends and colleagues encouraged him to appear on national television or release a strongly worded statement. He refused every invitation. "This should never become about me," he explained quietly. "If the conversation centers on one individual, we miss the larger lesson. The law protects every person equally, or it protects no one completely." His decision surprised many people. Rather than seeking attention, he requested only that the review remain transparent and that the department share its findings with the public once the investigation concluded. Several weeks later, the city announced the outcome. Independent investigators determined that the detention had lacked sufficient legal justification and that established procedures had not been followed appropriately under the circumstances. To resolve the civil claims arising from the incident and avoid prolonged litigation, the city approved a $3 million settlement. The announcement generated headlines across the country, but the amount itself was never presented as a reward. City officials described it as recognition of the seriousness of constitutional rights and the public responsibility to correct official errors when they occurred. Alongside the settlement came meaningful reforms. Officers received expanded training focused on constitutional standards, objective decision-making, and recognizing how unconscious assumptions could influence professional judgment. Supervisors adopted stronger review procedures for investigatory stops, particularly those involving allegations unsupported by direct evidence. Chief Hayes personally introduced the new policies, reminding every officer that public trust was earned one encounter at a time. Brandon attended every training session without exception. He no longer viewed the morning in Ashcroft Heights as the worst day of his career. He viewed it as the day he finally understood that authority carried an obligation to question itself before questioning others. Justice Reed never celebrated the outcome. He simply hoped that somewhere, another citizen walking through another neighborhood before sunrise might one day be treated with greater fairness because a difficult lesson had not been ignored. Sometimes the most valuable judgment is not the one written inside a courtroom. Sometimes it is the one that quietly changes how people choose to act long before another case ever begins 1 week later. At exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, the streets of Ashcroft Heights looked almost identical to the day everything had changed. The same porch lights glowed softly against quiet homes. The same breeze drifted through rows of tall trees. The same sidewalks stretched peacefully beneath the fading stars. Yet something invisible had changed forever. Justice Malcolm Reed stepped onto the familiar path wearing the same gray hoodie, the same black knit beanie, and the same running shoes that had carried him through countless mornings before. He had every reason to choose another route. He had every reason to change his routine. Instead, he chose to return, not because he wished to prove anything, but because fear should never become a permanent resident in the life of someone who had done nothing wrong. As he settled into his steady pace, several neighbors recognized him from a distance. The elderly couple who had witnessed the encounter offered warm smiles and quiet waves. The delivery driver, now beginning another early shift, simply nodded with genuine respect before continuing his route. No speeches were exchanged. No cameras followed him. Life had resumed, but it carried a deeper understanding than before. Several blocks away, Officer Brandon Pierce stood inside a community meeting room where a new class of recruits had gathered for constitutional policing training. He had volunteered to speak, believing that the most difficult lesson of his career might help someone else avoid making the same mistake. Standing before the room, he did not attempt to defend his decisions or soften their consequences. Instead, he told the truth. The greatest danger for any officer is believing that confidence can replace evidence, he said. Every citizen deserves to be judged by facts, not first impressions. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I hope none of you ever have to. The room remained silent as the recruits listened. Some took notes. Others simply reflected on the weight of the words. Chief Eleanor Hayes watched quietly from the back of the room, understanding that accountability had accomplished something punishment alone never could. It had transformed one painful experience into an opportunity for lasting change. Across the city, the policy reforms continued shaping daily police work. Supervisors asked more questions before approving investigatory stops. Officers documented objective facts with greater care. Training scenarios emphasized patience, observation, and a responsibility to challenge assumptions before acting upon them. Those changes would never erase what had happened on that quiet morning, but they ensured that the experience carried purpose beyond a single case. Justice Reed never spoke publicly about the settlement amount again. When asked privately why he had remained so calm throughout the entire ordeal, he answered with the same quiet wisdom that had defined him from the beginning. Anger can expose a problem, he said. Character can solve one. Years later, few people remembered the exact dollar figure approved by the city. Fewer still remembered the names printed in official reports. What they remembered was something far more valuable. They remembered that one ordinary morning reminded an entire community that justice is measured not by the power someone holds, but by the fairness they extend to those who appear to have none. Because the strongest laws are not proven when they protect the powerful. They are proven when they protect the stranger standing alone before sunrise, wearing nothing more than a gray hoodie, asking only to be treated with the dignity every human being deserves. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.